I smiled and walked back to my workshop, and I didn't say a word. That's the part people never believe when I tell this story. They expect me to say I cried, or that I slammed a door, or that I called my brother in Sudbury and complained for 2 hours. But I didn't do any of those things. I just walked back to my workshop, sat down on the stool next to my old workbench, and looked at the tools hanging on the pegboard that my father helped me put up 31 years ago. And I thought, they have no idea what they've just done. Let me back up. I'm 67 years old. I spent 34 years as a residential property assessor for the municipality, the kind of work most people don't think about until they're arguing with someone about square footage or lot lines or what qualifies as a finished basement. I know property law the way some men know hockey statistics. It's just in my head, always has been. My wife Elaine used to joke that I could walk into any house in a 50-kilometer radius and tell you within minutes what it was worth, who owned it, and whether the addition in the back had a permit. She wasn't wrong. Elaine passed 6 years ago. Breast cancer. Caught late. We had 14 months from diagnosis to the end, and I'll spare you the details of that time because some grief isn't meant to be shared with strangers. What I'll say is this. After she was gone, this house felt enormous, not in a good way, in the way that an empty church feels enormous, like the space itself is reminding you of what used to fill it. The house is a 4-bedroom bungalow in a neighborhood in Barrie, Ontario, about 90 minutes north of Toronto. Elaine and I bought it in 1989 for a price that would make young people today laugh or cry. I'm not sure which. We raised our son here, fixed the roof twice, replaced the furnace, put in a new kitchen in 2006. The deed has always been in my name. Just mine. When Elaine and I bought it, she was in the middle of a complicated situation with her previous estate, and we agreed it made more practical sense for the title to be mine alone. We never got around to changing that, and after she passed, it just stayed as it was. My son's name is Garrett. No, wait. I keep starting with his name, and that's not where this really starts. This starts with a phone call in March, 2 years after Elaine died. He called on a Thursday evening. He and his wife had been renting an apartment in Mississauga, a place they'd moved into when they got married 3 years before. He said the rent had gone up again. He said they were trying to save for a down payment, but it felt impossible. He said, and this is the part that got me, because it was true. Dad, you've got 4 bedrooms and it's just you rattling around in there. He wasn't wrong about that either. I said yes. Of course I said yes. He's my son. He was 29 years old and the housing market had gone completely sideways. And what was I supposed to say? No, pay someone else $2,000 a month while your father heats 4 bedrooms alone? I'm not built that way. I told him to come home. I told him and his wife both. I cleared out the spare room. I bought a new dresser from the place on Dunlop Street, and I made up the bed with the good sheets Elaine always saved for guests. His wife. I'll call her my daughter-in-law because that's what she is, though the word has complicated feelings attached to it now. She was polite at first. That's the honest word. Polite, not warm, not unkind, just polite in the way that a person is polite when they're tolerating a situation they didn't fully choose. She was 31, worked in digital marketing, always on her phone, always halfway through a conversation about something I didn't quite follow. She wasn't cruel. I want to be clear about that. What happened later wasn't cruelty exactly. It was something more like ambition that had no guardrails. The first few months were actually fine. We ate dinner together most evenings. I stayed out of their way. They stayed out of mine. I kept in my workshop in the evenings, or I'd watch the game in the den, and they'd have the living room to themselves. It worked because everyone was trying, and when everyone is trying, most arrangements can work. It was around the 6-month mark that things started to shift. The first thing I noticed was the kitchen. I'd always kept the kitchen a certain way, not obsessively, nothing strange about it, just my way. Elaine's way, really, and I'd kept it up after she was gone because it felt right. My daughter-in-law started rearranging things. The mugs moved, the cutting boards moved. The cast iron pan I've had since 1993 ended up on the bottom shelf where I had to crouch to reach it. When I mentioned it, She smiled and said she was just making better use of the space. I let it go. Then the living room furniture moved. The couch ended up against the wall instead of angled toward the fireplace the way we'd always had it. The side table with Elaine's reading lamp got pushed into the corner. When I said I'd always liked it near the window, my daughter-in-law said something about traffic flow and how the room felt much more open now. My son nodded in agreement. I stood there for a moment, looking at where the lamp used to be, and then I went back to my workshop. The guest room became an office. That was fine. I'd expected that. But then their dog arrived, a large and enthusiastic animal that wasn't supposed to be on the furniture and was, at all times, on the furniture. Then her sisters started coming for weekends, using my bathroom because the one in their room had a slow drain that nobody fixed. Then some of the tools from my workshop ended up in the garage to make room for storage boxes I'd never agreed to store. I brought these things up. Calmly, I mentioned the workshop tools. I mentioned the bathroom situation. I mentioned that it would be helpful if the lease timeline had some clarity. Not to pressure them, I said, just so we were all on the same page about planning. My son said he understood. My daughter-in-law said they were working as hard as they could to save money, and wasn't that the whole point of the arrangement? And didn't I want them to be able to buy a place of their own? She said it kindly, but there was something underneath the kindness that I recognized. I've spent 34 years assessing properties, which means I've spent 34 years in rooms where people were telling me one thing and meaning another. I know the texture of that. Summer came. They'd been living with me for 14 months. I was in the backyard on a Sunday afternoon, July, the kind of dry heat we get up here when the humidity finally drops, and the kitchen window was open. I wasn't trying to overhear. I want to be clear about that, too. I was tying up the tomato plants along the fence, and the window was open because it was hot, and voices carry. I heard my daughter-in-law say, "I think we should start pushing harder. He's not going to bring it up himself." I heard my son say something low, something I couldn't make out. She said, "He doesn't need 4 bedrooms. He doesn't need this whole place. He could get a nice apartment somewhere, something easier to maintain. At his age, honestly, it would probably be good for him." There was a pause. Then she said, "This house is worth close to $900,000 now. You know that. And eventually, it's going to come to you anyway. It just makes sense to start talking about it practically." I stopped what I was doing with the tomato plants. "He won't like it," my son said. "He doesn't have to like it," she said. "He just has to consider it." I stood there in the heat for a moment. Then I finished tying up the last tomato stake, picked up my gloves, and went back inside through the side door. My daughter-in-law was at the counter looking at her phone when I came through the kitchen. She looked up and smiled at me and said it was a nice afternoon. I said it was. I went down to my workshop and sat on the stool and looked at my father's pegboard. "I want you to understand something about how I am, because it matters for what happened next. I've never been a reactive person. Elaine used to say that I process things the way a document goes through a government office. Everything gets reviewed, nothing gets skipped, and by the time a decision comes out the other end, it's been looked at from every angle. She didn't always mean it as a compliment, but it's the truth about me. When something unsettles me, I don't respond immediately. I sit with it. I look at it from different directions. I ask myself what I actually know, as opposed to what I think I heard or what I'm afraid might be true. What I knew, the house was mine, legally and entirely. What I thought I heard, my daughter-in-law suggesting they maneuver me out of it. What I was afraid might be true, my son didn't fully disagree with her. I spent 2 weeks thinking. I went to the land registry office on a Tuesday morning and pulled the current title records for my property, which I could have done in my sleep, but which I wanted to have in hard copy in front of me. My name. My name only. The way it had always been. I thought about my options. I'm not a lawyer. I want to be honest about that. But in 34 years of property assessment work, you absorb a great deal about how real estate transactions work, what transfers require, what protections exist. I knew that no one could sell this house without my signature. I knew that no one could force me out of my own home. I knew that whatever my daughter-in-law was planning, it required my cooperation, and that was something she apparently hadn't thought through. But I also knew something else. I knew that if I confronted this directly, head-on, the way part of me wanted to, it would destroy my relationship with my son. He was in there somewhere. The boy who used to hand me tools in this very workshop. The one who cried when the dog we had when he was 12 had to be put down. The one who called me from university at midnight when a relationship ended and didn't know what to say, but just needed to hear my voice. That person was still in there. He'd just been standing in the wrong room, listening to the wrong voice. I needed them to understand something without me having to say it. I'm a practical man. I needed the facts to do the work, so I called the real estate lawyer I'd worked alongside for years through my assessment work, a woman named after a month of the year, which I always thought suited her because she had that particular quality of arriving at exactly the right time. I won't use a real name. She agreed to help me with something she found mildly amusing. We listed the house. Not for sale. Not really, but we created a proper listing, correct square footage, accurate lot assessment, photographs taken by a professional, and I had it quietly circulated through some channels that I knew would be seen by the right people. I didn't put a sign on the lawn. I didn't advertise it publicly. But I also had a very pointed conversation with my financial advisor, loud enough to be partially overheard on a Saturday morning when my daughter-in-law was in the hallway, about the possibility of downsizing and what the proceeds might allow me to do. I mentioned a condominium on the waterfront in Collingwood that I'd always liked. I mentioned a long-term trip through the Maritimes that Elaine and I had always planned, but never taken. I watched my daughter-in-law's face change. She didn't say anything that day, but the next day, she was suddenly very interested in how I was feeling about things. She asked if I was happy here. She asked if there was anything they could do differently. She said, and I give her credit for the nerve it took to say this, that she'd been thinking the house might actually be too much for them to take on eventually, and they were reconsidering their plans. I said I appreciated her honesty. That Thursday, she came to the kitchen table while I was having my morning coffee, and she said they needed to talk about some changes. My son was beside her, looking like a man who had spent several sleepless nights arriving at a position he wasn't sure he agreed with. She said it as gently as she could. I'll grant her that. She said they'd been thinking about the long term. She said they were wondering whether it might make more sense for me to find something smaller, something that would be easier to manage, maybe closer to services as I got older. She said they wanted what was best for me. I put down my coffee mug. I said, I appreciate that. I do. But I want to make sure we're all clear on something before this conversation goes any further. I got up and went to the filing cabinet in the den. I came back with the title documents and the assessment records, and I put them on the table. I said, this house is in my name. It has always been in my name. There is no shared ownership. There is no claim. If and when I decide to sell, the proceeds belong to me, and I'll decide what becomes of them. I haven't made any decisions yet about any of that, but I want you both to understand exactly what we're talking about, because I don't think we've all been working from the same information. My son looked at the documents. Then he looked at me. There was something moving across his face that I recognized. It was the same expression he'd had at 12 years old when he realized the dog wasn't coming home, when the facts of a situation he'd been avoiding finally arrived. My daughter-in-law was quiet for a long moment. Then she said carefully that she hadn't meant to imply anything about ownership. I said I knew she hadn't. I said it pleasantly because I meant it pleasantly. I wasn't angry anymore. The 2 weeks of sitting with it had burned through the anger. What was left was just clarity. And clarity is actually quite comfortable once you settle into it. There was a conversation that followed, longer than I'll describe here, uncomfortable in the way that honest conversations usually are. My daughter-in-law had very little to say. My son had more. He apologized in the fragmented, effortful way that men of his generation apologize. Not a clean apology, but the real kind, the one that costs something. He said he had let things go further than he should have. He said he'd been avoiding a conversation with himself that he should have had months ago. He said he was sorry. I believed him. They moved out 6 weeks later. Not because I asked them to. I didn't ask them to. They found a basement apartment in Barrie, cheaper than Mississauga, and they decided they needed to do it on their own. My daughter-in-law sent me a text the week they left that said she hoped there were no hard feelings. I wrote back and said there weren't, and I meant about 60% of that, which I think is a reasonable amount. The morning after they moved out, I made coffee in my kitchen. My kitchen, with the cast iron pan back on the hook where it belongs, and Elaine's reading lamp back beside the window where the light comes in at exactly the right angle in the afternoons. I sat in the chair near the fireplace, and I listened to the house. It was quiet. It was mine. Both of those things were true at the same time, and after everything, that felt like more than enough. My son calls every Sunday now. We don't talk about that period very much. There's an unspoken agreement between us to let it settle before we pick it up again, and I think that's probably right. A few weeks ago, he asked me if I was lonely out here. I said I had my workshop and my tomatoes and a backlog of books I hadn't gotten to yet, and he laughed in a way that sounded like himself again, like the boy from before all of this. And I thought, there he is. There are things I'd do differently. I wish I'd been clearer at the beginning about what the arrangement was and wasn't. Elaine always said I was too comfortable assuming that people understood what I hadn't actually said out loud. She was right about that. If I'd sat down at the kitchen table when they first arrived and said clearly, "This is my home, these are the terms, this is what I need you to understand," we might have saved everyone a year of slow, grinding misunderstanding. But I also know this. Some lessons have to arrive on their own timetable, and they arrive harder when they've been delayed. My son understands things now about this house, about his mother and me, about what we built here, about what it means that he didn't understand before. I don't know if he would have understood them any other way. I still eat dinner at the same time. I still go to the workshop after. Some evenings I open the kitchen window and let in whatever is coming off the yard. Cut grass in summer, wood smoke from somewhere in the neighborhood in autumn. That particular cold, clean smell that comes in January when everything is just snow and silence. And I think about the fact that Elaine and I stood in this kitchen for the first time in the winter of 1989, and she said she wanted to grow old here. We did that, as much as we could. And now I'm still here, finishing the part she didn't get to finish, in the house that is exactly as much mine as it has always been. That's enough. That's more than enough, actually.